a bad book. Hey, welcome back. It's the end of the year, which means it's time for my list of the worst books that I read that were released in 2022. It can be hard to determine what makes a book worthy of a worst list. Everyone's tastes differ, and a book that is fantastic to one person may end up on a worst read list for another person. So if a book you love is in this video, just remember that this is all personal preference. In no way am I deliberately trying to shit on these books. Just like everyone else, I have opinions. Also, this video might have light spoilers, but I'm definitely not going to get into every plot point, just the stuff that I hated. So let's get into it. Number 5, Weather Girl by Rachel Lynn Solomon. This was a romance book, and I picked it up because it has representations for two things that I've specifically been looking for. One, a main character who struggles with depression, and two, an overweight love interest. Because God, I am so sick of reading about 6-footers with abs. The book had these two selling points for me, and I was like, awesome. And then I actually read it, and I was like, I don't think that either of these representations were done very well. So neither of the characters had the confidence that I wanted them to have while representing these things. The main character, Ari's depression, I don't think was discussed very well, and she hid it from her past fiance. And that just left a bad taste in my mouth. And then with Russell, our love interest, the author would always have his stomach like bumping up against things and having Russell be all like awkward and apologizing about it. And like, I feel like there are better ways to describe a character as being bigger. Like, just let him be proud of himself instead of acting ashamed throughout the book. So that also just left a bad taste in my mouth. I guess I just like strong, confident characters, and neither of them were like that. Also, weirdly enough, the higher stakes romantic aspect in this romance book didn't even seem to be the relationship between the two main characters. It seemed to more be about their divorced bosses. So Ari and Russell and the divorced bosses all work at this news station together, and Ari and Russell decided that maybe their bosses would be happier and less of shitty bosses if they were still banging each other. So the vast majority of the book were the two main characters parent trapping the bosses and setting them up in scenarios where they would be forced to spend time together. It was weird. It didn't make any sense. It felt incredibly immature, and it wasn't any fun to read about. Plus, showing the chemistry between the two bosses just made it so much more obvious that the two actual main characters had no spark or chemistry between them. Number 4, Just Like Magic by Sarah Hogle. This author wrote one of my favorite books ever. It's You Deserve Each Other, and so when I got approved for the ARC of Just Like Magic, I was like, yes! I was so excited. I didn't even care what it was about. I was like, oh yeah, Sarah wrote it. Like, I am going to love it. No. This book features Betty, and she's an influencer who has fallen on hard times. She accidentally conjures up this man named Hall, and he is the holiday spirit, and he spends the holiday season with her and her misfit family during the week before Christmas. During this time, Hall grants Betty's outrageous wishes and works on trying to increase her holiday cheer. This book was like a bad fever dream. The story was odd and all over the place. Betty had too many family members jammed into the story that I did not care about, and they got way too much page time. And a personal hatred of mine is constant pop culture references in books, and this one had a lot of that. And then worst of all, the main character was just a nightmare to read. I had to force my way through this book because I could not stand her. I didn't find her charming or funny, and for the vast majority of the book, she was shallow and she was only concerned with her online appearance and status, which I thought was gross. And I think she was meant to be a bit of an unlikable character, and like you were supposed to grow to love her over time. But I don't feel like she had anything about her that I liked at all. And then in the end, her redemption arc wasn't enough for me to change my mind about hating her. This book should have 1000% been a short little Christmas novella instead of a full-length novel. It was way too long for what it was. And speaking of novellas, number 3, Under One Roof by Hazelwood. Ha! I've dogged on this book all year long, and I'm gonna dog on it again. If this book being on the list surprises you at all, well, obviously you haven't been watching my videos, friend. So this is a good opportunity for you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. So if you aren't new here, then you have definitely seen that I've posted other videos about Hazelwood's books that she's released this year. And the short of it is, I've had issues with all of them. Again, there are other videos I've done regarding that, so I'm not gonna get into all of the details, but the reason this specific book is on my list is it is the book of hers that haunts me the most. Have you ever had a moment where you randomly see the cover of a book that you hated and it makes you physically cringe? That's this book for me. I have a reaction every time I think of this book. In the beginning of reading this book, I was initially enjoying it, but then it just kept going further and further downhill. So this is a novella, and the premise of this book is that Mara and Liam are strangers who inherit a house. Liam already lives in said house and was the nephew of the woman who died, and Mara was the mentee of this woman. So Mara moves her happy little ass into the house, completely invading Liam's space, and then is confused when Liam is unhappy with the arrangement. Now, just a side note, if you are interested in the premise of this book, instead of reading this one, might I suggest a book by the author of Just Like Magic from the book of our number 4 slot. The book Twice Shy by Sarah Hogle, released in 2021, I actually did enjoy. I was a bit annoyed by the main character at first, but she grows on you. But basically, it's the same premise. 2 strangers inherit one house, and they have all sorts of like close proximity situations. And it's romance, so there's that. Now back to this one. So let me just tell you my problems with Under One Roof. Firstly, Liam is one of my least favorite characters I've read ever. In the book, he's supposed to be this highly successful lawyer, but he can barely mutter coherent sentences to Mara because he likes her. And like, I just don't buy it. The dialogue and him talking was just so cringy. I hated him, hated him, hated him. And also, if you want to talk about cringe, the sex scene. Oh dear Lord. This book had the cringiest sex scene I've ever read, and I primarily read romance books, so I've read a lot of sex scenes. This book is just one that I can't stand. The pacing the whole time throughout the book was just so off. It made no sense why the 2 main characters ended up together. And I hated that the prologue of the book was the start from the terrible sex scene from the end of the book. Like, who starts a book that way? Number 2, All Good People Here by Ashley Flowers. Oh boy, this book. I think there is something about being so excited about a book and then finishing it and it just so utterly falls flat that it just burns more than it typically would. So if you don't know, this is Ashley Flowers' debut novel. Ashley is the host of the Crime Junkie podcast, and this is a podcast I have actually listened to a lot. Whenever my husband and I go on long car rides, this is the podcast that we listen to. So when I saw that she was releasing a murder mystery novel, I was like, fuck yeah, I'll support Ashley and I'll buy it. You know, she knows a lot about true crime stories, so it'll probably be good. How wrong was I? Honestly, I thought this book was garbage. We have the main character Margot, who goes back to her hometown to live with her uncle, who's starting to show signs of dementia, and she's going to be his caretaker. About 25 years ago, when Margot was a child in her hometown, one of her friends was murdered, and now in present day, a young girl from a neighboring town has also been murdered. So in Margot's mind, she thinks that these 2 crimes from over 20 years apart have to be related. and she takes it upon herself to solve them. This book felt like Ashley Flowers' take and extreme opinions on the cold JonBenet Ramsey case. If you aren't familiar with the case, a 6-year-old girl was reported missing by her parents, presumed kidnapped for ransom, and later in the day she was found murdered in the family's basement. In this book, it felt like the case was mirrored or inspired by this case, with just some slight differences. JonBenet was a beauty pageant girl, while the girl in the book was a dancer, but there were a lot of similarities when it came to the family dynamics, and this is something that really disappointed me in the book. I don't feel like Ashley came up with an original idea. I just wish she would have been more creative. I just expected so much more from her since she dives into true crime on her podcast so much. Like, it's literally her job. But I felt like when I was reading this book, it just felt like Ashley kind of like made herself the main character and was being like, if only I could get my hands on some of these cold cases, I could really solve them. She just had everything fall into her main character's lap. For example, the main character of the book tracks down the brother of the victim from 20 years ago. He's now in a different state and he's changed his name. But she finds him, and when she asks him to talk about the case, he agrees, even though he's never talked about the case with anyone ever. Like, I just needed the author to be a lot more convincing with how good of a, like, journalist investigator the main character was, because the whole time I was like, wow, you're getting really lucky with literally everything. And lastly, I felt like she was trying to be very deep and shocking and edgy with the ending of the book, but it just pissed me off. The book essentially has a non-ending. Like, you aren't allowed to not have a resolution to the end of a book. I'm sorry, but that's just poor book writing 101, and I'm mad about it. All right, before we get to the #1 worst book I read published in 2022, let's look at some dishonorable mentions. House of Sky and Breath by Sarah J. Maas. Did this book piss me off the whole time? Yeah. Am I going to read the next one once it comes out? Yeah. Allie Hazelwood's other 2 novellas, Stuck With You and Below Zero, and her full-length novel, Love on the Brain. Obviously, I had to mention these books again. Just such a letdown. Book of Night by Holly Black. This was an urban fantasy book, and it had weird world building, and it was sloppy. And then there was this cringy main character who always talked about how badass she was, but we never saw her do anything. But honestly, this is one that ended on a cliffhanger, so when the second one comes out, I'll get sucked into reading it because the ending was actually pretty good. Kiss Her Once for Me by Allison Cochran. This could have been a cute queer romance story if the author wouldn't have over-explained every single character's, including side characters', sexuality and romantic preferences. She was constantly explaining and re-explaining it to the reader. It just got so annoying. Like, just let me read a story about these ladies falling in love without the dictionary definitions for everything sexual orientation based. Also, the main character of the book was dreadfully annoying and whiny. Didn't like her at all. And lastly, every few pages, the author would reference a specific song title and artist of a song the characters were listening to during that scene. I hate that. I think it dates your book so terribly, and I can't stand it. And the #1 worst book that I read this year that was published in 2022, Darling Girl by Liz Michalski. Whew, this is the creme de la creme of bad books. This was a pick in May for Book of the Month. And oh boy, I feel bad for you if you picked this one. I didn't get it through Book of the Month. I got it from the library. And thank God for that, because if I paid money for this book, I would have been so mad. I cannot believe that Book of the Month picked this trash as one of their monthly picks. This book was advertised as a dark Peter Pan story where Peter is the villain, but it was boring as fuck while managing to piss me off constantly. I kept reading this book because I could not believe how bad it was. Storytelling wise, it was a mess. This book was so poorly written, I thought it was a debut, but it's not. This book centers on Holly Darling, who is the great-granddaughter of Wendy Darling, the original Peter's girl. Holly is trying to find her daughter Eden, who has been in a coma for years, but now she's mysteriously disappeared. Holly also has a teenage son, Jack, who, first of all, doesn't know that he has a younger sister because he and his mom live in the States, while Coma's sister is holed away in the UK. Secondly, Holly needs the daughter back because over the years she's been having the daughter's blood shipped to her, and the daughter's magic blood helps to heal the son, who was previously severely injured in a car accident when he was a child. And Holly tells the son that it's his medical injections, when really she's just injecting him with his sister's blood without her knowledge. And now that Eden, the daughter, is missing, Holly is concerned that her son's health will deteriorate without his magic injections. But she doesn't really seem that concerned about the daughter missing. She just seems more concerned that she won't be able to get the blood while she's gone. Now this one I am gonna go more into spoilers with, just because it's the last one, so why not? So the daughter's magic blood is magic because she's Peter Pan's daughter. Now, Pan, as he's referred to in the book, is a sexual assaulting drug dealer who overdoses lost boys. The daughter Eden was born as a result of Pan's sexual assault on Holly, and he wants to try and steal the daughter away for her magic blood because he's dying in the real world. All of the characters in this book were awful. I didn't like any of them. Holly had absolutely no personality besides being overbearing. Holly and her son go to the UK so Holly can find Eden, and this is where we meet Holly's mother, whose personality was basically based on her being obsessed with Pan and being jealous that Pan never came for her. And for it being a Peter Pan-based book, Pan was talked about a lot, but he was barely in the book. We did get a few side characters that kind of somewhat relate back to Peter Pan. There's Cook, get it, instead of Hook. And he's this PI who Holly hires to help her find Pan. And then we also have a few quick scenes with Tink, whom Pan has been like funneling his like dying self into. That's at least how I remember it. But it makes her all like icky, and that's kind of the best word I have to describe it. And don't worry, the ending was just as bad as the rest of the book. I'm going to spoil it for you now. Pan kidnaps Holly's son and one of his friends. Holly and Cook track the boys down, and the son's friend has been overdosed and is just dead. Jane, the grandmother, drugs Holly and goes and takes care of Pan herself off the page. So the author didn't even have to write the grand finale, basically. And later when grandma gets back, we just get informed that what went down. And the resolution to their Pan problem was just Pan was disintegrated into dust. So now he's just gone. So then in the end, Eden and Grandma decide to go live in Neverland, and Holly and Cook end up together romantically, and we basically forget that Holly's son's friend was murdered. Womp womp. The ending was just so rushed, and it was such a letdown, but honestly, the rest of the book was also a letdown, so what was I expecting? So again, I have no idea why Book of the Month picked this book as one of their picks. It's baffling to me. So, but yeah, that is my least favorite book that was published in 2022 that I finished this year. So that is it for today's video, guys. There is just not a worse feeling in the world than finishing a book that you were so excited about and then being like, that was terrible. So those were my disappointments for books published this year. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. Be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss next week's video for the best books published in 2022. We'll see you next week. Bye.